In a prestigious educational institution like Westfield Academy, the atmosphere is typically characterized by an air of elegance and privilege. The towering iron gates gleam under the morning sun, serving as a testament to the school's esteemed reputation. Westfield Academy is not just any school. It is a bastion of excellence, known for its sprawling campus, meticulously maintained gardens, and state-of-the-art facilities. Brick buildings stand tall, adorned with ivy creeping up their red walls, and large windows overlook sports fields, laboratories, and lecture halls. The students who attend Westfield come from affluent backgrounds, their lives imbued with opportunities that others can only dream of. This school promises the best, and in return, it demands the best from its students. Elena Johnson was new to this environment, a thoughtful and introspective 13-year-old girl. She had grown up with the unwavering support of her mother, Marissa, a successful African-American entrepreneur whose charitable work and relentless efforts had brought her to great heights. Marissa was a woman of both confidence and grace, commanding respect and exuding strength. She had broken through countless barriers and shattered glass ceilings to achieve her success. Elena admired her mother deeply and was grateful for the chance to attend a school like Westfield. She knew her mother had worked tirelessly to provide her with this opportunity and did not want to let her down. However, on her first day, Elena began to sense the subtle divisions within the school. Walking down the gleaming hallways, she noticed whispers and sideways glances from other students. Her classmates wore designer clothes and carried themselves with an air of entitlement that made her feel out of place. Even though her uniform was identical, it somehow felt different on her. She held her books close, her gait lowered as she made her way to her first class. In that class, she met Mr. Thompson, the kind of teacher who prided himself on discipline and rigor, or at least that's what he called it. Tall and graying, he wore tailored suits and spoke in a clipped, polished tone. His reputation as one of the strictest teachers at Westfield was well known among students. He was the one you didn't want to cross, and his word was law in the classroom. His sharp eyes scanned his students as though sizing them up, looking for the slightest imperfection. On that first day, he barely acknowledged Elena when she introduced herself. Instead, he simply nodded, his expression indifferent, as he asked the next student to speak. Elena felt the coldness in his demeanor but brushed it off, perhaps thinking he treated all new students this way. Yet, as the days went on, she began to notice things, small, subtle things that added up. During a literature lesson, Elena raised her hand, her heart racing with the hope of contributing to the discussion. Mr. Thompson looked past her as if she were invisible. Minutes later, another student, Rebecca, a confident blonde girl from an influential family, raised her hand and was immediately acknowledged. It happened again and again until it became a pattern. Elena could no longer ignore the fact that she was always the last to be called upon, and her answers, no matter how thoughtful, were met with barely concealed impatience. Elena's heart sank a little more each day. At lunchtime, she sat alone, clutching her sandwich while her classmates gathered in groups, laughing and chatting. She tried once or twice to join a conversation, but her attempts were met with polite, dismissive smiles. The sense of isolation grew heavier, and she found herself retreating into her thoughts, questioning whether she belonged there at all. Marissa had no idea what was happening. She believed her daughter was thriving at Westfield, and Elena kept her struggles hidden. She didn't want to burden her mother or disappoint her by revealing how out of place she felt. Marissa had often told her, "You belong anywhere you choose to be, Elena. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise." Elena clung to those words, trying to muster the strength to ignore the subtle rejections and unspoken judgments she faced each day. As the week went by, Mr. Thompson's behavior escalated. He no longer ignored her contributions. Instead, he started to dismiss them. During a science lesson, Elena offered a solution to a problem on the board. Mr. Thompson's gaze shifted towards her, a thin, condescending smile on his lips. "That's an interesting perspective, Elena," he said, drawing out her name as if it were something foreign to him. "But perhaps you should leave the more complex concepts to the students who are more prepared." A flush of embarrassment spread across Elena's cheeks as quiet laughter erupted around the room. She felt small, insignificant, and helpless in the face of his subtle ridicule. She lowered her gaze, biting her lip to stop the tears that threatened to spill over. Inside, she felt a mixture of shame and anger. How could he treat her like this? She had studied hard, put in the work, and yet nothing seemed to matter. The next day, Mr. Thompson decided to conduct a chemistry experiment. He had students work in pairs, carefully measuring liquids and mixing them according to instructions. When it was Elena's turn, he handed her a beaker filled with liquid and told her to pour it into a flask. Nervously, Elena followed his instructions, but as she began to pour, Mr. Thompson smirked. "Be careful, Elena. This isn't something you want to mess up," he said loudly, his voice laced with mockery. Elena's hands trembled slightly under his gaze. She tilted the beaker, and as she did, a small amount of the liquid spilled over, splashing onto the table. Her classmates stifled laughter, while Mr. Thompson's face twisted in a sneer. "See, this is what I was talking about," he said, addressing the class as if Elena weren't even there. "Some students just aren't cut out for this." The laughter that followed was soft, but unmistakable, a chorus of judgment that pierced Elena's heart. She wanted to shrink into the floor, to disappear from the room, and never return. This wasn't just a mistake. It was a humiliation orchestrated by her own teacher in front of her peers. The shame was suffocating. When she got home that evening, Elena was silent. She sat across from her mother at the dinner table, pushing her food around on her plate. Marissa noticed the dark circles under her daughter's eyes, the way her shoulders slumped, and the lack of spark in her usually lively gaze. Concerned, she asked, "Is everything okay, sweetheart?" Elena hesitated, her mind racing. She didn't want to worry her mother or seem ungrateful for the chance to attend Westfield. But as she looked in her mother's warm, caring eyes, the weight of her experience became too heavy to bear. "Mom," she began, her voice barely a whisper, "I don't think I belong at Westfield." Marissa's face softened with concern. She put down her fork and reached across the table, taking Elena's hand. "What do you mean, honey? Why would you say that?" Elena's voice cracked as she recounted the small slights, the cold shoulders from classmates, and finally the humiliation orchestrated by Mr. Thompson. She tried to keep her voice steady, but tears streamed down her cheeks as she relived the painful moments in her mind. Marissa listened in silence, her grip on Elena's hand tightening as anger bubbled beneath her calm exterior. Her daughter's pain cut through her like a knife, and she felt a fierce protectiveness rising within her. She had spent her life fighting for respect and equality, and now her own daughter was facing the same battles in a place where she should have been safe and supported. "That man," Marissa said, her voice low and steady, "will regret the day he made you feel this way." Elena looked up, surprise flickering in her eyes. "Mom, you don't have to," she said, but Marissa interrupted her, her tone resolute. "You deserve to be treated with respect, and I'm going to make sure you get it." As she spoke, memories of her own struggles surfaced in Marissa's mind. Years of being underestimated, ridiculed, and dismissed. She had vowed never to let anyone make her feel small, and now she would do the same for her daughter. Mr. Thompson had underestimated them both, and he was about to learn a lesson in humility and accountability. That night, Marissa began to make her plans. She knew that Westfield depended heavily on her financial contributions, and she intended to use that leverage. Her resolve was unshakable, and her determination grew with each passing moment. The next morning, Elena's heart sank as she made her way to Mr. Thompson's classroom. The fluorescent lights seemed harsher, the walls colder, and each step felt heavier than the last. She had tried to tell herself that it would be fine, that maybe Mr. Thompson's behavior would improve, but doubt lingered like a dark cloud. She wanted nothing more than to turn around and run, to escape this place that seemed to want to push her away. The bell rang, and the students settled into their seats. The usual chatter and laughter filled the room. Mr. Thompson entered briskly, his sharp eyes scanning the class with the same steely detachment. His gaze landed on Elena for just a fraction of a second before he moved on, as though she were merely a blemish on the otherwise perfect tapestry of his classroom. "Today," he announced, his voice echoing with authority, we'll be conducting a demonstration of a chemical reaction. This is not a simple exercise, so I expect everyone to pay close attention and follow instructions precisely." Mr. Thompson's eyes glinted as he set up the materials on his desk. A series of beakers filled with liquids of varying colors, flasks, measuring spoons, and a Bunsen burner. The class leaned in with interest, but Elena felt a prickling sense of dread as she watched him organize the equipment. Mr. Thompson turned to the class, his gaze sweeping over them until it rested on her. "Miss Johnson," he said, his tone cold and calculated, "I believe you'll be assisting me today." Elena's heart pounded in her chest. She hadn't been called on to assist in any demonstration before, and Mr. Thompson rarely picked students to help him directly. She knew something was off, but there was no choice but to rise from her seat and join him at the front of the class. Her hands trembled as she stood by his desk, and she could feel the weight of her classmates' stares pressing down on her. Mr. Thompson handed her a beaker filled with a clear liquid. "Now, carefully pour this into the flask here," he instructed, pointing to a narrow-necked flask on the table. Elena's heart pounded in her chest. She hadn't been called on to assist in any demonstration before, and Mr. Thompson rarely picked students to help him directly. She knew something was off, but there was no choice but to rise from her seat and join him at the front of the class. Her hands trembled as she stood by his desk, and she could feel the weight of her classmates' stares pressing down on her. Mr. Thompson handed her a beaker filled with a clear liquid. "Now, carefully pour this into the flask here," he instructed, pointing to a narrow-necked flask on the table. Elena took the beaker in her hands, steadying herself with a deep breath. She moved to pour it into the flask, her hand shaking slightly under Mr. Thompson's watchful gaze. Her palms were sweaty, and her fingers felt numb with anxiety. Just as she began to pour, he spoke. "Wake up. Careful, Elena," he said, his voice dripping with condescension. "We wouldn't want you to make a mess, would we?" The words stung sharp as barbs, and a flush of embarrassment rose to her cheeks. She hesitated for a split second, and in that moment, a small splash of liquid dripped from the beaker onto the table. Mr. Thompson's lips curled in a smirk, and a soft ripple of laughter ran through the classroom. "See, this is precisely what I mean," he said loudly, his tone mockingly disappointed. "Some students just don't have the dexterity for this sort of work." Elena's cheeks burned, but she tried to ignore the laughter around her, focusing instead on finishing the task. She poured the remaining liquid into the flask, biting her lip to keep her composure. Her hands shook, her pulse pounding in her ears. She wanted to look anywhere but at Mr. Thompson, whose smug expression told her he had planned this all along. He wasn't finished. "All right, class," Mr. Thompson continued, directing his attention to the rest of the students. "This is why precision is key in science. You can't just stumble through things hoping they'll work out." Another round of quiet laughter spread across the room. Elena felt as if she were shrinking, her dignity crumbling under the weight of her classmates' judgmental stares. She wanted to scream, to disappear, to run away from the humiliation and hurt that throbbed inside her chest. "Miss Johnson," Mr. Thompson's voice broke through her thoughts, and she looked up, her eyes meeting his with a mixture of fear and anger. "Please clean up the spill and try to be more careful next time." Her hands fumbled as she picked up a cloth to wipe the table, feeling as though every move she made was a mistake. The room seemed to close in on her, the air thick with unspoken ridicule. She could feel the weight of her classmates' judgment, the subtle smirks and whispers that echoed in her mind. When the bell finally rang, signaling the end of the class, Elena gathered her books in a daze, her vision blurred with unshed tears. She made her way to her locker, feeling the hollow ache of humiliation settle deep within her. Her mind raced, replaying Mr. Thompson's words, his sneer, the laughter of her classmates, all of it swirling into a storm of shame and self-doubt. By the time she got home, she was exhausted, emotionally drained. She sat across from her mother at the dinner table, her appetite gone, poking at her food in silence. Her mind heavy with the memory of the day's events, she struggled to find the words to express her pain. Marissa watched her closely, noticing the shadows under her daughter's eyes, the way her shoulders slumped, and the absence of her usual bright smile. "Elena," Marissa said gently, reaching across the table to take her daughter's hand. What happened today? For a moment, Elena wanted to keep it all to herself, to bury the pain and pretend it didn't matter. But the warmth in her mother's touch, the understanding in her gaze, unraveled her defenses. The words spilled out, raw and painful, as she recounted every detail of the day's humiliation. She told Marissa about the experiment, about Mr. Thompson's mocking tone, the laughter of her classmates, and the shame that had wrapped around her like a suffocating blanket. Marissa's expression hardened, her grip on Elena's hand tightening. She listened intently, her anger simmering beneath the surface. This wasn't just a bad day at school. It was a calculated act of cruelty, a deliberate attempt to make her daughter feel inferior. When Elena finished, a single tear slid down her cheek, and she looked up at her mother, searching for reassurance. Marissa wiped the tear away, her voice steady but fierce. What Mr. Thompson did today was wrong. He had no right to treat you that way. But maybe I'm just not good enough, Elena whispered, her voice trembling. No, Marissa said firmly, her eyes blazing with determination. You are more than good enough, and you deserve to be treated with respect. Elena looked away, her shoulders hunching as she tried to hold back more tears. It's just that they all looked at me like I didn't belong, like I was less than them. Marissa's heart ached at her daughter's words. She had spent her entire life fighting against that same sense of inferiority, proving herself in a world that often saw her as lesser. She knew the pain of feeling unwelcome, the sting of prejudice, and she couldn't bear the thought of her daughter facing those same battles. This isn't about you, Elena, Marissa said, her voice soft but resolute. It's about them, Mr. Thompson and your classmates. They're the ones with the problem, not you. And I'm going to make sure they understand that. Elena looked at her mother, a spark of hope flickering in her eyes. What are you going to do? Marissa squeezed her hand, her lips pressed into a determined line. I'm going to the school, and I'm going to show them exactly who you are and why you deserve to be there. That night, Marissa sat alone in her study, her mind racing with plans and possibilities. She had built her career on resilience, on standing up for herself and her community. She knew the power she wielded as a financial sponsor of the school, and she was ready to use it. The next morning, she began making calls. She reached out to her contacts in the school's administration, setting up a meeting with the head of the school board. She spoke to her legal advisor, ensuring she had every necessary document in place to make her demands clear. She wanted Mr. Thompson held accountable, and she wanted the school to understand that this kind of behavior would not be tolerated. The next morning, Marissa began making calls. She reached out to her contacts in the school's administration, setting up a meeting with the head of the school board. She spoke to her legal advisor, ensuring she had every necessary document in place to make her demands clear. She wanted Mr. Thompson held accountable, and she wanted the school to understand that this kind of behavior would not be tolerated. As the week went on, Marissa found herself thinking back to her own experiences of prejudice. She remembered the job interviews where she'd been overlooked, the business meetings where her ideas had been dismissed. She had fought for her place in the world, and she had earned it. Now, she was ready to fight for her daughter's place too. But she knew that this fight wouldn't be easy. Mr. Thompson was well respected at Westfield, and his connections ran deep. Marissa would need to gather her allies carefully to build a coalition that would support her cause. She spent hours speaking with other parents, some of whom had also noticed Mr. Thompson's bias but had been too afraid to speak out. Together, they began to form a plan, a united front against the prejudice that had infected their children's education. On the day of the parent meeting, Marissa dressed with purpose, choosing a sharp suit that radiated confidence and authority. She arrived at the school with her head held high, her resolve unbreakable. She was here not only as a mother, but as a force of change, determined to make Westfield a place where every child was valued. As she entered the meeting room, the air was thick with anticipation. Parents, teachers, and school board members looked up, their eyes widening as Marissa took her seat at the head of the table. She met their gazes with a steely determination, ready to fight for justice and respect. This wasn't just about Elena anymore. It was about every child who had ever felt unworthy, every parent who had ever feared for their child's safety and dignity. Marissa was prepared to show them all that she was more than just a mother. She was a warrior for her daughter's future. That night, Marissa sat alone in her study, her mind churning with the weight of the previous day's revelations. She stared at her cup of coffee, untouched and cooling, as thoughts of her daughter's anguish flooded her mind. She couldn't shake the image of Elena's tear-streaked face, the pain in her voice as she described Mr. Thompson's humiliating treatment. Marissa knew she couldn't leave this unchallenged. She had fought too hard to build her life and reputation, and she would not let anyone make her daughter feel small. As the sunlight filtered in through the kitchen window, Marissa pulled out her phone and began making calls. Her first call was to one of her closest friends and legal advisor, Simone Turner, a fierce civil rights attorney who had always been a reliable ally. Marissa trusted Simone with her life. They had fought together in numerous battles for equality and justice, and Simone had never once let her down. "Simone, I need your help," Marissa said, her voice steady but laced with urgency. "What happened?" Simone's tone shifted immediately. Marissa explained the situation, describing every painful detail Elena had shared. She could feel her anger simmering beneath the surface as she recounted the way Mr. Thompson had belittled and humiliated her daughter in front of the entire class. By the time she finished, her hands were shaking, her grip tight around her coffee cup. Simone was silent for a moment, then spoke with a quiet determination. "Let's start by gathering everything we need. I'll make some calls and get back to you by the end of the day. We'll go over all the options and make sure you have a solid case." Relieved, Marissa thanked Simone and hung up. She felt a surge of renewed purpose. This wasn't just a fight for Elena. It was a fight for every child who had been told they didn't belong, for every parent who had been afraid to stand up for their child. Marissa was determined to make Westfield a place where no student would ever have to face the kind of prejudice her daughter had endured. Her next step was reaching out to other parents. Marissa knew she couldn't fight this battle alone. She needed allies. She made a list of parents whose children were also in Mr. Thompson's class, as well as those who had complained about his behavior in the past. She knew there were others who shared her frustrations, even if they hadn't been vocal about them. With each call, Marissa explained her situation carefully, gauging each parent's reaction. Some were sympathetic but hesitant, unwilling to jeopardize their children's education or their own standing within the school community. Others, particularly the parents of minority students, were more than willing to join her cause. They shared their own stories of prejudice, incidents that had been dismissed or brushed under the rug by the administration. Marissa listened to their experiences, her resolve strengthening with each story. By the end of the day, Marissa had assembled a small but committed group of parents who were ready to support her. They agreed to meet that evening at her house to discuss their next steps and devise a plan of action. Marissa knew this wasn't going to be easy, but she felt a renewed sense of determination. For too long, people like Mr. Thompson had been allowed to wield their authority unchecked, and it was time for that to change. That evening, as the parents gathered in her living room, Marissa took a moment to appreciate the diversity of the group. They were a mix of backgrounds, races, and professions, united by a shared purpose. The atmosphere was tense but hopeful, and as they settled into their seats, Marissa could feel a sense of solidarity forming among them. That evening, as the parents gathered in her living room, Marissa took a moment to appreciate the diversity of the group. They were a mix of backgrounds, races, and professions, united by a shared purpose. The atmosphere was tense but hopeful, and as they settled into their seats, Marissa could feel a sense of solidarity forming among them. Simone arrived shortly after, carrying a stack of documents and a notepad. She greeted everyone warmly, then took her place at the front of the room next to Marissa. The parents fell silent, their eyes fixed on her as she began to speak. "Thank you all for coming," Marissa began, her voice steady and strong. "I know this isn't an easy thing to do, but it's necessary. Our children deserve to feel safe and respected in their school, and it's up to us to make sure that happens." One of the parents, a man named Marcus, whose son had also experienced mistreatment, spoke up. "I appreciate what you're doing, Marissa. My son has come home more than once feeling defeated because of things Mr. Thompson said to him. But what exactly are we going to do? The school board is powerful, and I don't want to put my son's future at risk." Simone stepped in, her tone reassuring. "Marcus, I understand your concerns. The last thing we want is to jeopardize any of our children's education, but we do have options. We'll start by gathering written statements from each of you detailing your experiences and any incidents of discrimination you or your children have faced. I'll compile these into a report that we can present to the school board. They won't be able to ignore us if we stand together." Another parent, Maria, nodded in agreement. "My daughter has felt out of place at Westfield since day one. I thought it was just the adjustment, but now I realize it's more than that. Thank you for bringing us together, Marissa." As the meeting continued, Marissa outlined her vision for the campaign. They would approach the school board with their grievances, demanding not only the removal of Mr. Thompson, but also a thorough investigation into the school's policies and practices. They discussed various strategies, from media outreach to legal action, and Simone took notes, preparing a detailed action plan. When the meeting concluded, Marissa felt a renewed sense of hope. These parents had entrusted her with their stories, their fears, and their frustrations. She was determined not to let them down. She walked them to the door, thanking each of them for their courage and commitment. She knew this was only the beginning, but she was ready for whatever challenges lay ahead. The following week, Marissa received a call from the head of the school board inviting her to a private meeting. She accepted, her heart racing with anticipation. This was the moment she had been waiting for, a chance to confront the administration directly and make her case for change. On the day of the meeting, Marissa dressed with purpose, choosing a tailored suit that radiated confidence and authority. She wanted to make a strong impression, to show the board members that she was not just a concerned parent, but a force to be reckoned with. As she arrived at the school, she took a deep breath, steeling herself for the conversation that lay ahead. The meeting took place in a conference room filled with polished wood furniture and leather chairs. The members of the school board sat around the table, their expressions a mix of curiosity and guardedness. Marissa recognized several of them from school functions, but today she saw them in a new light. They were the gatekeepers of the school's reputation, the ones who held the power to make real change or to maintain the status quo. Marissa took her seat, her steady gaze meeting the room as she addressed them. She began by explaining the incidents that had led her to this point, detailing Mr. Thompson's behavior and the impact it had had on her daughter and other students. She presented the written statements from the other parents, each one a testament to the pain and frustration their children had endured. The board members listened in silence, their faces impassive as they took in her words. But Marissa could sense a shift in the room, a growing awareness of the gravity of the situation. When she finished speaking, she handed them the report Simone had prepared, a meticulously organized document outlining their grievances and demands. One of the board members, a woman named Miss Radcliffe, cleared her throat and spoke. "Miss Johnson, we appreciate your concerns, and we take these allegations seriously. However, Mr. Thompson has been a respected member of our faculty for over 20 years. We would need substantial evidence to take any disciplinary action against him." Marissa met Miss Radcliffe's gaze, her voice unwavering. "With all due respect, Miss Radcliffe, we have more than enough evidence. These statements are just the beginning. I've also spoken with a legal team, and we are prepared to take this matter to the press if necessary. Westfield has built its reputation on excellence and integrity, but allowing this kind of behavior to go unchecked is a betrayal of those values." The board members exchanged uneasy glances, the weight of her words sinking in. Marissa could see the cracks beginning to form, the realization that this was not a battle they could easily brush aside. After a tense pause, the chairman spoke. "Miss Johnson, we understand your position, and we assure you that we will conduct a thorough investigation. In the meantime, we ask for your patience and cooperation as we address these concerns internally." Marissa nodded, knowing that this was only a partial victory. The investigation was a step in the right direction, but she knew she would have to keep the pressure on if she wanted real change. As she left the conference room, she felt a surge of determination. This wasn't the end, it was just the beginning. Outside, she called Simone, filling her in on the details of the meeting. Simone listened carefully, then offered a piece of advice. "They're going to try to delay this, hoping it'll die down. Don't let up, Keep the parents informed and be prepared to go public if they don't take action soon. Marissa agreed, feeling a renewed sense of purpose. She was ready to fight, not just for Elena, but for every child who had ever felt unwelcome, every parent who had ever feared for their child's safety and dignity. She knew the road ahead would be difficult, but she was more determined than ever to see it through. The day of the parent-teacher conference arrived sooner than expected. Marissa had spent the last few days preparing for this moment, poring over documents and reviewing every detail of her argument. Simone had helped her compile all the written statements from the parents, each one a heartbreaking testament to the prejudice their children had faced. As she dressed that morning, Marissa chose her outfit with purpose, a sharp tailored suit in deep navy, a color that symbolized authority and confidence. She looked at herself in the mirror, her gaze steely and focused. This wasn't just a meeting, it was a battleground, and she was ready to fight. Elena sat on the edge of her bed, watching her mother with a mixture of admiration and anxiety. She had never seen her mother like this, so determined, so powerful. Marissa turned to her, giving her a reassuring smile. "Today, Elena, we're going to make sure they hear us," Marissa said gently, resting a hand on her daughter's shoulder. "This isn't just for you. It's for every child who's ever felt like they didn't belong." Elena nodded, drawing strength from her mother's words. She was still nervous, but knowing that her mother was standing up for her gave her a sense of courage she hadn't felt before. She hugged her mother tightly, whispering, "Thank you, Mom, for everything." As she left the conference room, Marissa felt a surge of determination. This wasn't the end, it was just the beginning. She knew she needed to keep the momentum going and ensure that the school board took the necessary actions. Outside, she called Simone, filling her in on the details of the meeting. Simone listened carefully, then offered a piece of advice. "Marissa, they're going to try to delay this, hoping it'll die down. Don't let up. Keep the parents informed and be prepared to go public if they don't take action soon," Simone said firmly. Marissa agreed, feeling a renewed sense of purpose. She was ready to fight, not just for Elena, but for every child who had ever felt unwelcome, every parent who had ever feared for their child's safety and dignity. She knew the road ahead would be difficult, but she was more determined than ever to see it through. The following week, Marissa received a call from the head of the school board inviting her to a private meeting. She accepted, her heart racing with anticipation. This was the moment she had been waiting for, a chance to confront the administration directly and make her case for change. On the day of the meeting, Marissa dressed with purpose, choosing a tailored suit that radiated confidence and authority. She wanted to make a strong impression, to show the board members that she was not just a concerned parent, but a force to be reckoned with. As she arrived at the school, she took a deep breath, steeling herself for the conversation that lay ahead. The meeting took place in a conference room filled with polished wood furniture and leather chairs. The members of the school board sat around the table, their expressions a mix of curiosity and guardedness. Marissa recognized several of them from school functions, but today she saw them in a new light. They were the gatekeepers of the school's reputation, the ones who held the power to make real change or to maintain the status quo. Marissa took her seat, her steady gaze meeting the room as she addressed them. She began by explaining the incidents that had led her to this point, detailing Mr. Thompson's behavior and the impact it had had on her daughter and other students. She presented the written statements from the other parents, each one a testament to the pain and frustration their children had endured. One of the board members, a woman named Miss Radcliffe, cleared her throat and spoke. "Miss Johnson, we appreciate your concerns, and we take these allegations seriously. However, Mr. Thompson has been a respected member of our faculty for over 2 decades. We would need substantial evidence to take any disciplinary action against him." Marissa met Miss Radcliffe's gaze, her voice unwavering. "With all due respect, Miss Radcliffe, we have more than enough evidence. These statements are just the beginning. I've also spoken with a legal team, and we are prepared to take this matter to the press if necessary. Westfield has built its reputation on excellence and integrity, but allowing this kind of behavior to go unchecked is a betrayal of those values." The board members exchanged uneasy glances, the weight of her words sinking in. Marissa could see the cracks beginning to form. the realization that this was not a battle they could easily brush aside. After a tense pause, the chairman spoke. Miss Johnson, we understand your position, and we assure you that we will conduct a thorough investigation. In the meantime, we ask for your patience and cooperation as we address these concerns internally. Marissa nodded, knowing that this was only a partial victory. The investigation was a step in the right direction, but she knew she would have to keep the pressure on if she wanted real change. As she left the conference room, she felt a surge of determination. This wasn't the end, it was just the beginning. Outside, she called Simone, filling her in on the details of the meeting. Simone listened carefully, then offered a piece of advice. They're going to try to delay this, hoping it'll die down. Don't let up. Keep the parents informed and be prepared to go public if they don't take action soon. Marissa agreed, feeling a renewed sense of purpose. She was ready to fight, not just for Elena, but for every child who had ever felt unwelcome, every parent who had ever feared for their child's safety and dignity. She knew the road ahead would be difficult, but she was more determined than ever to see it through. A week later, Marissa received a call from the school. The board had completed their investigation and would be holding a press conference to announce their decision. Marissa felt a surge of hope mixed with apprehension. She knew this could be a turning point, but she was also wary of empty promises and performative gestures. On the day of the press conference, Marissa arrived at the school with Simone and the other parents by her side. The room was filled with reporters, their cameras flashing as the board members took their seats at the front of the room. Mr. Collins stood at the podium, his expression serious as he addressed the crowd. After a thorough investigation, the board has concluded that Mr. Thompson's actions were not in line with the values of Westfield Prep School. Effective immediately, Mr. Thompson will be placed on administrative leave, and we will be implementing new policies to ensure that every student feels safe and respected within our school. The room erupted in murmurs as reporters scrambled to jot down notes. Marissa felt a sense of relief, but she also knew that this was only part of the battle. She stepped forward, catching the attention of the room as she addressed the board directly. We appreciate your decision, Mr. Collins, but we expect the school to follow through on these promises. This isn't just about removing one teacher. It's about creating an environment where every child can thrive without fear of prejudice. Mr. Collins nodded, his tone conciliatory. You have our assurance, Miss Johnson. We are committed to making Westfield a place where all students are valued. As the press conference concluded, Marissa felt a sense of closure mixed with determination. This was a victory, but it was also a reminder of the work that still needed to be done. She turned to Simone, a quiet smile of gratitude passing between them. Outside, Elena was waiting, her face lighting up as she saw her mother approach. She hugged Marissa tightly, her voice filled with gratitude and relief. Thank you, Mom, for everything. Marissa held her daughter close, her heart swelling with pride. Always, sweetheart, always, she whispered. As they walked away from the school together, Marissa knew that this was only the beginning. She would continue to fight to stand up for what was right and to ensure that her daughter and every child had the opportunity to learn and grow in a world free from prejudice. Thank you for watching this video. If you like the story, don't forget to subscribe to our channel so you don't miss new episodes. We have many more exciting things to come. Click on the next video for more stories and stay tuned.